Well, we just sang a song that said, among many other things, all my life, God has taken care of me. All my life, I've lived under His protection, in His hands. If I were to paraphrase that song a little bit, we could say, I've never had anything to worry about. I've always been safe. Is that true? Is it? Have you always felt like that? Not at all. We're talking about stress today as our story, our key illustration to help us grab hold of what we'll be looking at in the Gospel of John, in the book of John in the Bible. We'll be in chapter 6 today. And there are some seriously stressed out people in John chapter 6. Seriously stressed out people. All right, so what stresses you out? You thought about that earlier. Hopefully you're still thinking about it. Get that feeling of stress in your mind. I'll tell you one thing that has stressed me out in my life. I mentioned this earlier. It's been a constant battle. I've made some progress. Is money. Money has stressed me out a lot. In 2016, I quit a job that I had been at for 10 years. And I had prayed to God about it. I said, lead me in this. And I felt like God was telling me, I'm going to take care of you. And so I was so excited. God's going to take care of me. I'm going to go for a while. Intentionally, I was going to go for a while without a job, without an income. And I was a little bit, I was excited about that, a little bit nervous. But I thought, you know what? I trust God. I trust that He's going to provide for me. And so for about 8 months, I went without any kind of income at all. And I was stressed out about money probably 75% of the time during those 8 months. I was actually shocked at how stressed I was about money. It surprised me. I thought that I trusted God more than that. And guess how many times I ran out of money during those 8 months? 0. 0 times. I had everything that I needed. Sometimes the money came in really sort of normal ways that you might say, okay, that could have been somewhat expected. Other times it came in ways that were totally unexpected. And at times when I was not really trusting God, I was super stressed. And still the money came in, and I was just fine. If I look back on my life, maybe you could say the same thing. I don't know, think about it. I've always had everything that I needed. And yet constantly I stress out, or I'm tempted to stress out, about not having everything that I need. What's up with that? Okay, think about this for a minute. It is not, here I'm going to tell you something. It is not our circumstances that cause us to stress out about things. That's not what causes it. Do you believe me? I know it seems like it, right? Okay, you say, yeah, well, if I had like $1 billion, I would never stress about money. Yeah, really? I bet you would. Haven't you met people? Aren't there people in your lives? I'm thinking of one person who I know right now who has, they're maybe not the most money of anyone I know, but on the high end of all the people I know, and they're stressed out about money all the time. And haven't you also met people who have very little, who aren't stressed about money at all? Of course, you meet poor people who are stressed about money too, and you meet rich people who aren't. But here's the point. It's not the circumstances that cause you to be stressed or not. It's actually coming from deeper than that. It's coming from what's inside of us. And this is one of the big points of Jesus in His whole ministry. And this is why He's constantly saying this word, believe, trust, have faith. Believe, trust, have faith. All right. We're in a series of messages right now called Come Back. Yes, come back. We're trying to come back together, come back to church, come back to life. And there is a way to come back to life because of Jesus. We're taking a fresh look at the life of Jesus, and we're doing that through this book in the Bible called John. It's called John because it was written by a dude named John. That makes so much sense. Sometimes the Bible's really straightforward like that. Written by this guy named John, who was one of the best friends of Jesus. Actually, he calls himself in his own terms, sort of Jesus' best friend. Now, Jesus had a lot of friends, so I don't know if he was the very best. But he wanted to be Jesus' very best friend, and so do I. Hopefully you do too. And so he wrote this book when he was in his old age. We talked about that a few weeks ago. And there'd been other books already written about what had happened during Jesus' life. And he is writing, in many ways, for a new generation. The generation who had been around when Jesus was on earth has now, that generation is gone when he's writing this book. And he's thinking about people who weren't there, like us. And he's trying to get across to us, what was it like to be around him? Because it changed everything, and because he's still here. And you can still experience him and be around him. That's one of the big points that John's going to try and get across to us. But you got to know what it's like so that you recognize him, because you can't see him with your eyes anymore. Anybody here ever seen Jesus with their physical eyes? No, but he is here. I know that might sound, if you're new to this, that might sound, oh, these Christians are so weird. Why would they think that? I didn't used to think that, but it's true. He's actually here with us. You can learn to live with him, and you can learn to rely on him, and he comes through in real ways. It's astonishing. And when it happens for you, changes everything. Changes everything. Okay, so we talked about John. Then we have these big stories. So one of the things we're doing during this series is we're coming back to some of the same stories again and again. So you got to keep them in your mind. There's sort of two things we're asking you to do during this series. We're asking you to invite people to come and see. That's a theme throughout the book of John, is that people are saying, come check this guy out. Come find out what he's really like. We're asking you to think and pray about who to invite. It's not about manipulating people or pestering them. It's about letting God lead you and extending an invitation to someone. Many of you here had never been to church and then someone invited you, or you hadn't been in a long time and someone invited you. Raise your hand if that's you. Not now, but at some point in your life. That was me for sure. I would not have gone. That was me. So we're asking you to invite people. The second thing that we're asking you to do is read the book of John. All right, accountability moment. We said 4 weeks ago, I think it's been, we said, hey, read through the whole book of John this week. It'll take you maybe 2 or 3 hours. How many of you made it through the whole book yet? A couple of you. And then we said you should keep reading it over and over again. Is anybody who's read through it and then started it again? Yeah, a couple people. It's not about guilt. It's about, I'm just encouraging you to do this. I'm encouraging you to actually do it. As you do it, and as we come back to these stories again and again, they're going to start to become familiar to you. So let's refamiliarize ourselves with a few of the stories. We talked about the story of Nathanael meeting Jesus. That was a powerful moment, and we don't even know why. Remember that? We talked about that a few weeks ago. Because Jesus spoke some words to him that were very personal to Nathanael. And immediately Nathanael said, I give my whole life to you. I'm just going to follow you around. That's the new thing I'm going to do. Forget my job. Forget everything else. Because whatever Jesus spoke to him, Nathanael realized that this guy had always been with him. This guy was different than everyone else he'd ever met. Then we jump forward to the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman. You remember that story? And Jesus changed her entire life with a few words as well. He offered her some water. What kind of water did he offer her? Living water. And she was a person who was hiding because she felt like she'd screwed up her life so many times. And what she experienced in Jesus is, number one, she realized he already knew everything about her. Everything about her. And then she realized, and this is what destroyed her and remade her life, she realized that he accepted her and loved her completely. 100%. Even though he knew all of that stuff. Boom, she's never the same. We jump forward after that. There was this story of the official's son, right? And his son was dying, and he comes and begs Jesus to come heal his son. And Jesus is like, I'm not coming to your house, but just trust me, he's healed. If you can trust me, then he's healed. And the kid lived. At that very moment that Jesus spoke it, we saw Jesus didn't even have to be present to heal someone. And then what was the story from last week? You guys remember? Lots of people remember. If you're at home, just like 20 people just shouted it out. No one said anything. Healing of the man born blind. And that story is so deep, we're going to have to come back to it again and again. But we saw in that moment, the big question was, does that blind man actually want to be healed? That might sound like a silly thing, of course, but no, that's a real question. Does he really want to be changed? And then we saw that the Pharisees, some of the pastors and religious leaders, they didn't want to be changed, did they? What they wanted to believe was that Jesus was not who he says he is. And so even when something totally astonishing, the healing of a man born blind, happened right in front of their eyes, they could not believe it. Seeing was not believing. That's what we saw last week. Seeing is not the same as believing, because your heart can dramatically influence what you see, even with your physical eyes. It's crazy. All right, and this week we're up to a story, big story, amazing story, more than we can ever cover in this story today. John chapter 6, and the feeding of the 5,000. Now, if you've been in church for a long time, you know that story. Maybe you've never heard it before if you're just checking us out. This story is a story that every single person who wrote a book about Jesus, okay? In the Bible, there's 4 books that are about Jesus' life. What are they? Say them out loud with me. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Excellent. We're looking at the book of John. All 4 of these guys who wrote this down, they all said this story is extremely important. Every single one recorded their own version and eyewitness accounts of what happened in this particular moment. And I think it's for a number of reasons. One, it's the big guns. Remember, we talked about when Jesus in chapter 4 of John, when Jesus had healed, he talked to Nathanael in chapter 1, and then he healed this official's son. Remember what he said? He said, I've been doing all these miracles, these little hidden miracles, because he was looking for people's hearts. He was looking for people who wanted to follow him. But then he said, he's looking at these crowds, and he says, kind of out loud, but to himself, he says, you know what? Unless you people see miracles, so many of you are never going to believe. And it's at that point that he starts to change. He gets out, I'm saying it this way, he's pulling out the big guns now. He starts to do huge things, like the healing of the man born blind. That's something that had never happened in the history of the world. There is no example in the Old Testament of someone healing a person born blind. So this is an astonishing miracle that no one could deny. But then this time, now he's getting out even bigger guns. The feeding of the 5,000. He's going to feed a huge crowd of people with nothing, virtually nothing. He's going to create food out of thin air. Did that really happen? We're going to see as we looked at through today, it really did. That's what all of these eyewitnesses are trying to grapple with. We were there. This happened. We have no idea how. What does it mean if this happened? What does it mean if this happened? Okay, so we'll do it kind of in 3 parts. We'll check out, let's see, where are we at? Okay, we'll check out, first of all, sort of the build-up to it. What happened just before this? What is Jesus walking into this scene from? Then we'll talk about the actual healing. And then we'll talk about the results, because there were 2 things that happened right after it that are super important. And we're not going to draw a ton of conclusions today, other than the title of the sermon itself. The title of the message today, you've got it. Do you got your papers if you're here in person? Hey, if you're at home, if you come in person, we have an amazing gift for you. It is a piece of paper with some notes on it that you can fill in the blanks and you can write. We'll even give you a pen. So if Jesus isn't enough to get you to come and hang out with people of God together, a piece of paper and a pen. That's what we're offering here at Community of Hope. All right? So the title of the message today is this: God will provide. And that's also our main point and the thing that Jesus is trying to get across to us. All right? Now you hear that? Okay, God will provide. Great. What does that mean? All right, so let's take a look at what is Jesus walking into this situation from? Oh my goodness. A lot of hard stuff. Persecution. We're not going to go to the text yet. I'm going to talk a little bit more first, because this is stuff that happens right before this in John chapter 5. Jesus is walking into this situation that we're about to read about, the feeding of the 5,000, from some really difficult things. Persecution and desperation. Those are the 2 things that are happening to him and around him. First of all, we haven't talked about this guy much because it's a little confusing, because it's the book of John. there's also a person in the book called John the Baptist, who is not the guy who wrote the book. Don't get too confused about that. All you really need to know about him right now is that he was a close friend of Jesus and he was a relative of Jesus. And what's happened right before this, he was also a man of God. He was a preacher. He spent a lot of time alone praying in the wilderness, and many people had come out to see him. He was the person who had announced to the nation that Jesus was actually the Messiah, and some people had started to follow him. And what's happened just before the feeding of the 5,000 is that this person who's very close to Jesus, very close to his heart, has just been executed by the government. In a really awful way. We won't go through the details, but really awful situation. For what? For doing good stuff. That's what he was executed for. For telling the king that the king had done something wrong, and the king really had done something wrong, and the king executed him for it. What does Jesus feel like in that moment? In fact, the background to this story, the feeding of the 5,000, is that Jesus goes away from the cities. Okay, he's in the region of Galilee, which is kind of in the north of what we think of as, the region of Israel today. It's this big lake, big, huge lake. And there's some cities on that lake that he spends a lot of his time in, but he now goes away from the city, somewhere where there's nobody around. He goes out to the woods. He goes out to the desert. Have you ever felt like that? You ever been in a place in your life where I just got to get away from people? I can't believe what just happened. I got to go be alone. He takes his disciples, his closest friends with him, but nobody else. And he goes off to be alone. So that's the persecution. He's also been experiencing some direct persecution. Some of the leaders have been arguing with him. He's been arguing with them. In fact, he's been kind of stirring them up on purpose. That's what we saw last week. And some of those leaders have decided that it might be better if Jesus were dead. So think what that feels like. Think what it feels like in your life when someone you know just doesn't like you. How does that feel to you? How would it feel if a bunch of the important people that you knew wanted to kill you? How would that feel? So Jesus has just had this loss, this person's been executed, and a lot of important people who he actually cares about and wants to see them grow, they want to kill him. And so he goes off by himself to kind of be alone with his disciples. Now, here's the second part is desperation. As he is alone off in the wilderness, probably, a full day's walk away from these cities, thousands of people, thousands and thousands of people walk out to find him. They just get up, leave whatever they're doing, and trek out into the desert, into the arid kind of scrub land, not really knowing where he is, not knowing how long it's going to take to get there, not bringing anything with them, doing anything they can to just find this guy. Why in the world did they do that? One more illustration for you here. These are some images of, what are these images of? Do you guys know? This is recent. This is news. Yeah, this is Del Rio, Texas. What was it, like a week and a half ago? These are 15,000, mostly Haitian refugees, immigrants attempting to immigrate to the United States. They were all under the international bridge in Del Rio, Texas. So I show this picture for a couple of reasons. Number one, to give us a sense of what does 15,000 people look like? Because that's how many people came out to see Jesus. I know it's the feeding of the 5,000, but the disciples, the people who wrote this down, are very clear. There were only 5,000 men, and we didn't number the women and children who were present. So maybe 10 to 15,000, we don't really know, but it's like this. Okay, without the port-a-potties and the bridge and all that stuff, right? Think about that for a minute. There's no port-a-potties. Don't think about that too long. What does 15,000 people in the desert to see Jesus, what does it look like? It looks kind of like this, but maybe a little worse. Also, I show these images to say, why did those people come? Why did they trek out into the wilderness to find him? Why did these Haitian refugees come? Because they were desperate. because there's awful stuff happening in Haiti. And they feel like their lives are going nowhere and they don't really have any hope. And so they put their hope in President Biden that he would let them into the United States. And he did not. There's tons of debates. I'm not weighing in on the debates. There's tons of problems on both sides of that. But here's the thing, President Biden can't save them. That's part of the problem. But that's why they came, because they were desperate. And they put their hope in the fact that they might be able to enter the United States under President Biden. And they made an immense journey to get there, actually way further than the people who came out to see Jesus. But very similar mindset. These people came out to see Jesus. Why? Because they were desperate. They were probably desperate in lots of different ways. Some of them were desperate because they had relatives who were sick, and pretty much there's no doctors. That kind of thing, doctors who really could solve things, most things didn't exist, right? So they're really desperate. I got a sick relative. I'm going to drag them out into the wilderness to see if we can find this Jesus guy. Others are desperate because they are living under an oppressive government. And they don't know how to ever break free of that and this cycle of poverty that they're in. But when this guy speaks, it seems like there's hope. And others are desperate just for God. They maybe move beyond. And when they hear this guy speak, they have hope that he might be the one that God sent. And so imagine the feeling. These towns are not huge. We are talking about probably a significant portion of the population of the whole region runs out into the wilderness. When's the last time you took like an 8 or 10 hour hike? Has it been a while? Some of us maybe have never done that. What would that be like? That's like pushing yourself to the physical limit. For many people, for me, it's pushing myself to the physical limit. That's what these guys do to go find Jesus. They are desperate to find him. And then we find out in just a minute that they didn't really bring much with them. They didn't pack out their 40-pound, rucksack to make sure they had enough food and water. They just got up and left, took whatever maybe they could grab and carry in their hands. And so by the time Jesus is done doing what he does, there's no food left for these people. All right, let's read it. Jesus has been out there. He's been healing them. We're going to see that in a minute. Okay, let's just read it. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed the shore of the Sea of Galilee. That is the Sea of Tiberias. Side note, John is always speaking to that next generation, right? He's now speaking to people who didn't live in this region, and people who lived outside the region didn't call it the Sea of Galilee. Back then, they called it the Sea of Tiberias. He is translating his language for a new generation. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick, and they're desperate. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" Start to wrap your mind around this. There's 15,000 people in front of them. 15,000, and they're in the desert. Where should we buy bread for these people to eat? He asked this only to test him. Wouldn't it have been fun to be one of Jesus' disciples? He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, I think he laughed first. "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each person in this crowd to have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Hey, here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But what good is that going to do? How far is that going to go among so many people?" Jesus said, "Calm down. Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves and he gave thanks. Now, if you've been a Christian for a long time, you should be noticing some things here, some similarities to things that we do quite often. Jesus took the loaves and he gave thanks and he distributed those to those who were seated as much as they wanted. And he did the same thing in the same way he held up the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. Wow. All right, we're going to make a few observations about this. We're in the second part. We did the build-up, make some observations about what happened, and try to get our minds into what it would have been like to be there, okay? And then we're going to talk about, at the end, we'll talk about the response to this, because the response is astonishing. Okay, so try to put yourself in the shoes of the disciples. There were 15,000 people in front of them in the desert. And there's no plan for how these people are going to eat. Last night we had a harvest party. Were any of you guys there? Yeah, a few people. It was super fun. And I gave some instructions for that harvest party. Here were my instructions, different than in previous years, similar to last year, but we didn't have as many people last year. My instructions for the harvest party were this: bring your own food and bring something to share. And I'll tell you what, okay, I'm not, a lot of people, some people came up to me and said, "I don't know what that means. What do I do with that instruction?" Other people came up to me and said, "Is that going to work? What are we going to do?" And especially in that moment when people started to show up, because here's what happened. Some people showed up without their own food. And that was guaranteed to happen. It always happens. And we didn't have even an organized potluck. It was an interesting thing. I think as a culture, we know how to do potluck. And we know how to do like an organized prepare a meal. But what I'm trying to get us as a church to figure out how to do is just bring some food and just spontaneously share with each other. And it worked last night, actually. There was plenty of food. By the time it was done, there was more than enough food left over. There was no miracle. We bought it all at the store. But there was plenty of food left over. But for that moment, especially when people were still showing up and we didn't know how many people were going to come, there were a number of people who were stressed out and were bringing that stress to me, and I was stressed out from their stress a little bit. I was having to, okay, just trust God. Okay, Jesus, I'm preparing this message. Okay, Jesus can feed 15,000 people. I'm sure it's going to be okay. We got like 100 people with some hot dogs. I'm sure we're going to be fine, right? But that's an illustration to ask you this question. What would it have felt like to be one of those disciples? Can you imagine the pressure that they must have felt like they were under in that moment? These people don't have any food, and they're a full day's walk from even the nearest town where they could buy it. These people, in another time, in the feeding of the 4,000, Jesus doesn't want to send the people away without feeding them because they might faint on the way. That's what he says. Could you imagine the pressure that these guys were under to feed these 15,000 people and how impossible that seemed to them? Because it was impossible, right? And so look back at Philip's answer for a minute. This is remarkable. Jesus asks him one question, and Philip responds with something even more basic. Jesus asks him, back to the previous where Philip responds. He asked Philip the question, where are we going to buy enough food? And Philip's response is basically this: forget where. We're not even up to that problem yet. We got to solve where are we going to get the money to buy these people enough food first. Before we even go try and find a bakery, much less find a bakery that has enough food for 15,000 people already prepared, first we got to solve how are we going to get enough money. He says it's going to cost more than half a year's wages, so let's just go with $30,000. Okay, that's a low estimate in their money. Okay, so somebody says to you, where are we going to buy $30,000 worth of bread? Where am I going to get $30,000? That's the first question, right? Do you have $30,000 in your bank account ready to just swipe that debit card? You can't swipe a debit card for $30,000, right? Okay, so Philip is stressed. Jesus, you're out your mind. You're thinking, you're way beyond here, okay? And then it's clear. So Andrew comes back with this kid who's got like these 5 barley loaves, right? Which you could think of like as like large dinner rolls, and 2 fish, small ones. It's clear that while Philip is answering him, Andrew and the other disciples have done a search for food. And so they probably haven't searched the entire 15,000 people, but they've gone to all the people who are like close to them, right? And that they know that who's got food. Does anybody have any food? We're trying to find a way to feed these people. You got anything? And this is what they came up with. 5 dinner rolls and 2 fish. That's all the food that they can find that's present. That's it. How would you feel if that was just all the food you had left in your house? Almost all of us would probably be stressed if all we had was 5 dinner rolls and 2 fish. We would probably go to Costco immediately, right? Think about how stressed these guys are. Okay, so observation number 1 about this. Well, that's number 1. They're super stressed out. And Jesus stresses them out on purpose. He stresses them out on purpose in order to test them, in order to stress them out, to see how much faith they have, to see if they're going to trust God, and to see if he can get them to grow in their faith. So far, as they've been with Jesus, they've had no income other than whatever people happen to give them, and they've always had everything that they need. They've seen Jesus heal people. They've seen him do remarkable things, and everything that they've needed has been supplied. Are they still going to be able to trust when Jesus stresses them out on purpose? That's a question. Sometimes big stresses come into your life. Why does God let those come into your life? So that you can learn to trust him more. That's why. That's why. Over and over, you're going to see in this book of John, Jesus has one goal. He's going to say it when we get to the end of this series. You're going to see it happen again and again and again and again. The goal is this: believe. He just uses the same word over and over again. Could be translated believe or trust, have faith. Believe, 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 believe. Will you believe? Second thing to notice, this kid is the only person who has food that they can find in the crowd. And he's ready and willing to give it away when Jesus needs it. Think about that for a minute. What do you think his mom thought about that? We're out here in the middle of nowhere. Nobody's got any food. We're the only ones who have food. And you want to give it away to Jesus. Just put yourself there. I mean, any good mom is going to be like, no, you don't. We are keeping that food. Come on, we got to take care of ourselves here, right? Why does this kid so readily give away the food when Jesus wants it, or just when his disciples ask for it? I want you guys to think about that this week. It's on your notes. Try to imagine why. I mean, there could be a lot of reasons. Maybe someone in his family has just been healed by Jesus. That could be. This kid has faith. Do you see it? He doesn't know what Jesus is going to do, but he's not trying to make sure he has enough. He's like this: sure, whatever you want. Yeah, I know it's the last food that I have or anyone else around me. All right, I trust you're going to take care of me. I've always been taken care of so far. Which way are we living? Which way? And the last thing is just this: Jesus is trying to get across this big point. God will provide. That's what he's trying to drive deep into his disciples. That's what he's trying to drive into us. That's why this story is so important to these writers who wrote down this life of Jesus. They're trying to help us see what Jesus did for them. They're trying to bring it to us, that you will be taken care of if you just trust God. That seems like insanity in our world. Often that seems like craziness. Really? If I just trust God, I'm going to be taken care of? Yes, that's what Jesus is saying. He came back to life from the dead. He defeated death. He has taken care of you your whole life. He made you. And what he's trying to get across to me and to all of us here by his Spirit, constantly he's trying to get this across. Look, you're safe. I know the world looks really scary. It looks like you got to make sure you got enough for yourself and take care of number one, but you are safe if you trust me. There is nothing that's ever going to get you if you trust me. Stop stressing out. Now, that's going to take us a long time. You can't just flip a switch and do that. But that's what he's doing in the lives of the disciples here. All right, last observation. We're going to come back to this story again and again as we move through. But last observation, let's read the end of it. This part is great. This part is hilarious to me. This whole story is hilarious to me. But this last part, man, this is just exactly what we do. After the people saw the sign that Jesus performed. Okay, so number one, these people were not confused. Sometimes people have presented this story as if maybe it was like a secret miracle and nobody really knew where the bread came from. Nuh-uh. These people knew that Jesus had just made bread out of thin air. They knew. You can see in their response, later in the chapter, they go hunting for him because, okay, they knew what had just happened right in front of their eyes. They are stunned. What would you be like in that moment where you just saw these 5 loaves and then 15,000 people ate as much as they could eat? You'd probably just sit there and not know what to say. I mean, you'd probably be asking other people, did that really just happen? I think so. I mean, there were only 5 loaves, right? Like, how did we all eat? How are there 12 baskets full of bread right now? And so as they talked with each other and they all agreed, yeah, I think that happened. You saw that too, right? Yes. And then they started to say to each other, surely it must be that this is the prophet who was going to come into the world. Like if he can do that, how could he not be the guy that God has been ready to send for all of history? If he can do that. Let's go back to that text. Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. So, I mean, look at this. This is how we respond, right? Jesus is trying to get across this big point. God's going to provide for you. You're safe. If you just trust me, you don't have to worry about what you have or about taking care of your own life. You just have to follow me. That's all you got to do. And they watch him try to make that point. And here's how their thinking goes. That guy can make bread out of thin air. Let's get him. That guy can make food appear out of thin air. We are going to make him be our king. If he can do that, we got to have this guy locked. We got to have him in the castle where we can keep track of him and like make sure that he's taking care of us. They take away exactly the wrong point from Jesus. God does something amazing. They say, let's control it. Let's put it in a box and make sure that we always have that thing that God just did. Jesus is trying to say, no, you're safe. And he runs away once again. What kind of a person is this? If you had 15,000 people who are like, you are the best person we've ever met. We love you. Be our king. What would you say to that? Would you be able to resist that kind of temptation? It doesn't even touch Jesus. Jesus looks at this crowd and he runs away. He does this multiple times, especially early in his ministry. He looks at a crowd, he realizes they all love him, but for completely the wrong reason, and he runs away from them. He leaves again to another place. He doesn't trust what's inside of them. He knows that if he follows the way that they want him to go, everything's going to crumble. It's not going to lead to anything good. He goes away to the mountainside to continue to trust his Father in heaven to lead him. And so if we're taking away one big point from today, it's this. It's very simple. And it's my prayer that the Holy Spirit would speak it to your heart. God is real. He's with you right now. And if you trust him, you're completely safe. He will provide everything that you need. Let's pray. We'll continue in worship.